On the morning of June 10, 2026, a single photograph began spreading across social media faster than anyone expected. It showed a 19-year-old standing against a plain prison wall, his head freshly shaved, his shoulders covered by a sleeveless prison-issued uniform, his expression almost impossible to read. Just 24 hours earlier, that same teenager had been sitting in a Texas courtroom waiting to learn how much of his future remained. Now, the answer was staring back at the world from a prison intake photo. 35 years. That was the number attached to his name. 35 years before freedom could even become a possibility. For many people following the case, the image felt different from everything that had come before it. The trial was over. The headlines had already been written. The debates had filled television screens and social media feeds for months. But that photograph represented something else entirely. It represented the moment when public controversy ended and prison reality began. Because this story is no longer about a courtroom argument or a jury deliberation. It is about what happens after the cameras leave. It is about what happens when a teenager enters one of the largest prison systems in America and begins facing consequences measured not in days or months, but in decades. On June 9, 2026, a Collin County jury found Karmelo Anthony guilty of murder in connection with the fatal stabbing of fellow student Austin Metcalf during a high school track meet in Frisco, Texas. The incident occurred on April 2, 2025, when a confrontation between two teenagers escalated into violence that would permanently alter multiple lives. Prosecutors argued that Anthony intentionally caused Austin Metcalf's death. The defense maintained that he acted in self-defense. After hearing days of testimony and reviewing the evidence, the jury reached its decision in just a few hours. The punishment phase followed shortly afterward. The jury had the authority to sentence Anthony anywhere from 5 years to life in prison. They chose 35 years. Because he was convicted as an adult under Texas law, he must serve a significant portion of that sentence before becoming eligible for parole. Even under the most favorable circumstances, he will spend the remainder of his youth and much of his adulthood behind bars. And that raises the question at the center of this entire story. What really happens when a 19-year-old enters the Texas prison system with 35 years hanging over his future? The moment the sentence was announced, the reality of the case changed forever. For more than a year, the focus had been on the investigation, the courtroom testimony, and the debate surrounding what happened beneath that tent at a Texas track meet. But once the jury delivered its decision, those arguments no longer determined what came next. The legal battle had entered a different phase, and Karmelo Anthony's future was now tied to a prison system that operates according to its own rules. Following the sentencing hearing, Anthony was taken from the courtroom and placed into custody. The transition happened quickly. High-profile inmates often move through the system under increased security precautions, especially when their cases have attracted nationwide attention. Reports indicated that he spent his first hours separated from the general jail population while officials coordinated the next stage of his transfer. For someone who had spent months surrounded by lawyers, family members, reporters, and courtroom observers, the sudden isolation represented a dramatic shift in reality. Less than 24 hours later, that reality became visible to the public. A newly released intake photograph began circulating online. The image immediately became one of the most discussed developments in the case. It was not because the photograph revealed anything unusual. In fact, it showed exactly what prison intake procedures are designed to produce. The shaved head, the institutional clothing, the plain background, the absence of any personal identity beyond the information attached to an inmate record. Yet people reacted strongly because the image seemed to symbolize something larger. Courtroom footage can sometimes create the impression that a case is still unfolding, that another hearing or another argument may change everything. A prison intake photograph sends a different message. It signals that the sentence is no longer theoretical. It is happening. Anthony was transferred into the custody of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, entering a correctional system that houses tens of thousands of inmates across the state. Like every newly processed prisoner, he now faces a period of classification and evaluation that will help determine where he ultimately serves his sentence. Officials review numerous factors during this process, including age, security concerns, disciplinary history, and housing requirements. For most people watching from the outside, these administrative procedures sound routine. But for the person entering the system, they mark the beginning of an entirely different life, one measured not by freedom, but by years. As the days following his conviction continue to unfold, attention remains focused on where Karmelo Anthony is housed and what his future inside the Texas prison system may look like. For many people, prison is often imagined as a single place with a single experience. The reality is far more complicated. Every facility has its own culture, its own routines, and its own challenges. But one thing remains consistent throughout nearly every correctional environment. Young inmates entering the adult prison system face obstacles that older prisoners have already spent years learning how to navigate. At 19 years old, Anthony enters a world where experience carries value and inexperience can become a liability. Most first-time inmates arrive without fully understanding the social structure that exists behind prison walls. There are rules written in official handbooks, and then there are rules that exist only through daily interactions between inmates. Learning the difference can take time. Mistakes that seem minor on the outside can create serious consequences inside. What makes Anthony's situation particularly unusual is the amount of public attention attached to his name. High-profile cases do not disappear when prison gates close. News coverage reaches inmates. Television coverage reaches inmates. Conversations about nationally known cases often travel through correctional facilities long before a newly sentenced prisoner arrives. That means Anthony enters the system carrying a reputation that was formed before he ever stepped inside it. Some people view public recognition as a form of protection. Former correctional officials have often suggested the opposite can also be true. Attention attracts curiosity. Curiosity attracts scrutiny. And scrutiny can create additional pressure for someone already attempting to adjust to an unfamiliar environment. The transition becomes even more difficult when the inmate is still at an age where most people are only beginning adulthood. While friends from high school prepare for college, jobs, relationships, and independent lives, Anthony faces a completely different reality. His daily schedule is now determined by institutional rules rather than personal choices. His movements are restricted. His opportunities are limited. The freedom to make ordinary decisions that most people never think about suddenly disappears. That is one of the least understood aspects of long-term incarceration. The sentence is not experienced all at once. It is experienced day by day, routine by routine, year after year. And for a 19-year-old facing decades behind bars, that adjustment process begins immediately, whether he is prepared for it or not. Beyond the physical reality of prison life lies another challenge that is often far more difficult to measure: the psychological weight of a long sentence. Numbers written on a court document can appear simple from a distance. 35 years. 2 words. 1 number. But for someone who is 19 years old, that number stretches across nearly every stage of adulthood. Consider what that timeline actually means. Anthony will spend his 20s inside prison. He will spend most of his 30s inside prison. The milestones that typically define adult life for many people will occur behind correctional walls rather than in the outside world. Birthdays, holidays, family events, and opportunities that once seemed ordinary now exist within a completely different context. Researchers who study long-term incarceration have repeatedly found that extended confinement can produce significant emotional and psychological strain. Feelings of anxiety, isolation, uncertainty, and depression are frequently reported among inmates serving lengthy sentences. The impact can be particularly pronounced among younger prisoners because they enter the system during years that normally involve personal growth, independence, and identity formation. Instead of developing within society, they develop within an institution. At the same time, Anthony's legal team continues pursuing an appeal. That process remains active, but appeals rarely move quickly. Court filings, legal reviews, and procedural requirements often take months or even years before a final outcome is reached. During that period, daily life inside prison continues regardless of what may eventually happen in a courtroom. The sentence does not pause while legal arguments are reviewed. Yet no discussion of this case can end with Karmelo Anthony alone. Another family continues living with a loss that cannot be appealed, reversed, or reduced. Austin Metcalf was 17 years old when he died. He was a student, an athlete, a son, and a brother whose future ended on a single afternoon. The consequences of that day continue to extend far beyond the courtroom where the verdict was delivered. For one family, the sentence marks the beginning of decades behind bars. For another family, it follows a loss that will last forever. That is why this case continues to generate such intense debate. It is not simply a story about guilt or punishment. It is a story about consequences, tragedy, and two futures that were permanently changed on the same day. And long after the headlines fade, those consequences will remain. As of June 2026, Karmelo Anthony remains in the custody of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, beginning a sentence that will shape the next several decades of his life. His appeal is moving forward through the legal system, but appeals are measured in months and years, not days. For now, the reality is simple. Every morning begins inside a prison cell. Every decision about his future rests in the hands of a system that moves slowly and rarely changes course overnight. At 19 years old, Anthony stands at the beginning of what could become one of the longest chapters of his life. If parole is eventually granted at the earliest possible opportunity, he could walk free in his mid-30s. That may sound distant to some people, but for someone entering adulthood, it represents an enormous portion of the future. There is a possibility that one day he leaves prison having learned from the choices that brought him there. There is also the possibility that years spent inside a difficult correctional environment leave marks that cannot easily be erased. The truth is that nobody knows exactly who Karmelo Anthony will be decades from now. Not the public, not the courts, not even the people closest to him. What we do know is that a single confrontation lasted only moments, while its consequences may last a lifetime. One teenager lost his life. Another lost his freedom. Two families continue living with the aftermath in completely different ways. And a case that began at a high school track meet has become one of the most debated criminal trials in recent memory. Perhaps that is why people remain so divided. Some believe justice was served exactly as it should have been. Others believe the punishment went too far. And many still find themselves caught somewhere in the middle, struggling to reconcile the tragedy of what happened with the sentence that followed. So what do you think? Was 35 years an appropriate sentence for this case? Was it too severe, too lenient, or the only outcome the jury could reasonably reach? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want future updates on the appeal, potential legal developments, and any major changes in this case, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. This story is still unfolding, and the next chapter has yet to be written. Thanks for watching.